When you log in to the Plixer platform, you'll drop into one of these higher level monitor type views. So that can be dashboard views that summarize all sorts of kind of information that you've found useful over time. Anytime really you find a workflow that was helpful, it's kind of always worth saving that off as a data source. And then if it's turned into a dashboard gadget like these, they're both available for high level visibility, as well as they become pivots that take us directly into data. So we'll go back through in a moment through the entire reporting stack as to how we get to these products. But it is always important to kind of keep in mind as you go through that really none of your effort is ever wasted on the platform, because when you find a valuable view that helps you solve a problem, it can always be saved as a data source, turned into something like a dashboard gadget or just a save report for quick access. And then you can just return exactly to that view, maybe make some filter changes for whatever the specific problem is at the moment. And again, give you just kind of a nice jump off point where there's an expected quantity and quality of data that you can rely on in the moment when an investigation or application degradation is happening in real time. Again, this kind of brings us right from the finished product into a report. But if we start back at the beginning, we can see we have a few different ways of accessing data. So reports come in, there's some issue, maybe on like a WAN side link at a site. We can start from an interface perspective where we have a view of all of our interfaces that are reporting into the product. The flow caches that we talked about in the previous step, when they're actually turned into flow monitors for actively collecting things that are happening, they get applied at an interface level. We not only have all of our exporting devices, so the actual network infrastructure as a whole exporting to us, but the visibility is broken down on a per interface basis as to where those flow monitors are applied. What this ultimately allows us to do is get great views into per interface network observations. So we don't have to rely on, this device did this in aggregate or whatever. We can actually drop down to just the physical interfaces, or virtual. So I guess that's a bad choice of words, but the actual point that's handling the traffic, and see exactly what the state of it was at that point in time. So if there's any sort of transformation happening in a traffic flow, maybe an application was configured for like EF DSCP, thinks it's the highest priority because it's some sort of real-time application, but the network really isn't prioritizing those things. Maybe the application at the first hop said, like, I'm definitely an EF packet. Please let me skip the queue and push me through right away. If that device has a different classification schema on it, it maybe makes an augment to that class of service marking. And then ultimately at that next hop, you can actually see that change. Again, by looking at this from an interface perspective, we have really granular views. And again, we're talking in 1 minute, so we have as granular as flow can be and as granular as an observation point can be. We can see at every hop in its path if there was some sort of transformation made to the packet. A great way for validating DSCP schemas and making sure that your intended markings are showing up at the segments of the network that you'd expect them to be. So for workflows like that, when we start with all of our interfaces here, we can go up to our filter icon and actually work in the interfaces. So if we have a series of interfaces that are WAN interfaces and kind of the SNMP name, all of this information scraped through SNMP. So again, you just set up a device to export to us, and then we'll just start pulling it for SNMP things to actually learn what are these interfaces, what are they called. So that way there's really no guessing as to like, what does this index represent exactly? We can work in kind of the names we're used to. But in this case, we can search our interfaces for just our WAN interfaces. And then once we have our kind of subset of interfaces there, we can actually pivot into a report that will use all of those interfaces as our input domain. So that was kind of the first slide of the slide deck area, was really being considerate of input domains and where are we sourcing data from at any point in time for what we're looking at. Having one place where all of your various inputs are being fed makes this really nice because you can move pretty quickly between them. And then again, ultimately, the analytics stack that's going to review all the data has all of the input data from the entire network to review. We've selected our WAN interfaces. We can click on into reports. Again, we'll look at some more interesting ones. Anytime you're in the product, if you're pretty green to flow or green to the product, a great place to start will be our pair reports conversation by app. This will give you a very kind of standard NetFlow view where you've got that basic 5-tuple of source, destination, port, and protocol, and then ultimately some collected metrics against those, in this case, bytes and packets. And that gives us just a way of kind of quickly moving over and getting an idea of what hosts are using which applications on our WAN interfaces in this case, because that's where we started. We started with our interface list, filtered down to just the WAN interfaces, and then pivoted over into actually what is the content of the traffic that those interfaces are handling. Starts at a pretty high level. It's pretty verbose, lots of entries. There's lots of other ways to summarize these things. At any point in time, when you're working in reports in the product, our filtration stack is actually going to follow us from step to step. So if we want to change report types to look at the data kind of cut up in a different way, but we've already applied some filtration, that's perfect. That will hang on and follow us, even if it's not a field that's necessarily explicitly in the next report. As an example, we see a lot of this SRV finance host that's participating in conversations here. If we actually wanted to grab this and bring it into the include section of our filter tray, we can see that adds a filter for that host in both kind of directions of the conversation, whether it's the source or destination, and we can reapply. So without changing the report type, it's pretty reductive because this is what we were already looking at. We basically filtered on a quantity that we could already see in here. But with that filter applied, we can actually now change our report type and look at something that's very basic, like just our application definitions, because we have carried over this idea that this very busy host on the WAN we brought as a filter. So we know all the conversations that we're looking at have this host participating in them. And now we're purely looking at the applications. And we can see that just this financials application is really the only component that that host is handling. This financials application is actually a great example of enrichment on the platform. So if we were to run this in just like a well-known port type of view, where we're not imputing our kind of local application destinations or definitions, we can see this is just kind of HTTPS 443 TCP. So just generic transport, really difficult to tell this apart from just kind of basic web browsing traffic all the way through data transfers and more as time goes on. A lot of things by the day seem to just get more further and further encapsulated in HTTPS. From this type of view, again, we know our context still. We picked our WAN links. We filtered down to the busiest host utilizing the WAN links. We took a look at the application. We saw it was our financial application. But if we didn't have that definition in there, we can see from this perspective that it would just be kind of this generic 443 TCP traffic. So this gets interesting in the sense that when we come into admin and definitions, where we can actually define the things that are unique to our environment, we can go into our application view and actually see what that financial thing represents. In the case of your own environment, you already know that'd be kind of the those buzzwords within the NOC or SOC of applications that you hear about on a regular basis. But from this perspective, we can see that financials is going to be TCP 443 for some specific IP addresses. And in this case, we can see that IP address we were filtering on in our example report is actually one of those. Again, it gives us a great idea where for generic traffic, this would just be HTTP 443, but specifically when it's HTTP 443 being handled by that host we filtered on, the platform knows that this is the financial application. So again, if that's where we're investigating is application degradation along the lines of that specific application, we now have a pivot where we can go in, just look specifically at this financials view and get an idea of when it's being used over kind of whatever portion of the network it's an issue. Again, in this case, we filtered down specifically to WAN. So in the cases where we have less information, right? So maybe this is not an active incident. This is something that was reported previously. And one of the biggest struggles of those scenarios can always be trying to replicate the actual network environment at the time when the incident was reported. So in this case, we might know what devices are involved, if it's a specific firewall that's kind of the topic of conversation, or maybe we only know things about the content of the traffic themselves. So on the platform, when we click into Run Report, we have two options. The one on the left here is going to be selecting devices. Again, the case where we know the actual network infrastructure that we want to investigate, or just selecting report types where we're going to work more in the content of the traffic. In that case, if we wanted to go to select report type, we get a view of kind of our recently used reports and recommended, and then ultimately a big list of all the high-level categories that we can report around. So each of these will have a subset of views inside of them. So firewall events example, there's a few different ways of cutting that data up. But what's really powerful is, and going back to when we were talking about IPFix and the template structure in the slide deck, the platform reads the templates in, understands what information elements we can use, and then dynamically will change what's available for reports to the user. You'll really never be presented with something that you don't have data for. And it will also just give you a great view at this kind of high level of reporting as to what types of vendor support or, again, those exotic information elements you actually do have availability to, and new workflows that you can kind of leverage because they're present. If we think about something like Palo Alto devices are very strong exporting devices. They can go through and label everything very explicitly with applications using the DPI engine that's in the Palo Altos themselves that it's going to use for traffic inspection in the first place, as well as username export. In the case that you're, maybe terminating a VPN with the firewall, it has an idea of what user is attributed to that traffic, and it can export that in the flow data. So if we go through and just quickly look at what that looks like, we can take that firewall, get an idea of who the users are. Again, these could be people or service accounts. Who's using what at what point in time. So if the event that we're investigating is attributed to the report of a specific user, we can actually take a device like this because it has that information, start from the perspective of that user, maybe this Allen Brand, click into them, and then just like the IP addresses in the previous view, we can actually use this user now to pivot between other data. So if we want to see, exactly what type of flow data is attributed to this user, we can use our pretty standard conversation by app report again, that basic NetFlow view. But again, this time with kind of the background understanding that all of these flows are being attributed to this specific user, even when they're not necessarily, active and present in the conversation. So then finally, one kind of interesting view is going into our IP group definitions. From the IP group definitions, we again understand kind of the functional usage of the different IP addresses and subnets on the network. And we can start our reports from that perspective. At a very high level here, I'll go into our pair reports and IP groups with applications defined. And I'll grab just our firewall devices again and move those over and then run the report. And now this will actually give us a view, and I'll change our graph type, something like Sankey that better represents kind of flow between nodes. And from this view here, we can immediately get a high-level view for our firewalls that we used as our input domain. We have the visibility into now what applications are being handled, but additionally, what functional centers of the business are those applications, moving between. In the case that you need to investigate a problem that's affecting a specific vertical of the business, we can always filter down to something like this NYC data center and make sure that's either the source or destination of conversation and reapply. And again, that'll filter out all the results that aren't specific to this one node here. As again, we can see it as both a source and destination on each side. Once we've kind of filtered down to the content that we're looking for our root cause analysis workflows, we can go back to a temporal view. So something like the line view that will show us usage over time. At this point, we can go in, we can kind of see when there's spikes of usage, when there's pretty big lulls in usage. And this is really where we pivot back to the idea of our granularity and preserving all the different levels while still making the aggregates. So right now we're working at 2-hour intervals, so we can move really quickly, look across really wide frames of time. But as we click and grab sections of the graph, this spike in activity, we can actually drill in. We are now down in 30-minute intervals, so we have a great idea of kind of what's going on, again, over these still wider time frames. We're looking at about a day of data in this case. And then we can further go down right into these peak values and continue to move into more and more granular data until we're actually working against kind of the atomic level flow records themselves. By kind of using this method, we can visually identify where the spikes in utilization are. Through using kind of the enrichment components like IP groups, we can understand kind of what function of the business is impacted at these points of time, what applications that are maybe unique to us are impacted at this time, and then ultimately drill down into these lower level views. Once we get into these lower level views, I'm just going to keep us on one firewall for a moment. We can actually pivot all the way through to a raw flow view. So this actually gets us all the way back to the records exactly as they were exported from the original exporting device themselves. We can go all the way from our super wide time frames of over the last day, when is this device the busiest, or when is this network segment the busiest, drill down, find those spikes kind of through that graph navigation, and then ultimately land on the raw records as they were produced by the device. So these will be the, kind of the actual evidentiary components of supporting kind of the result of your investigation, all the way down to actually pulling these records, seeing things like class of service on them, and having an idea as to what or where in the network, rather, those mutations may have occurred.